My husband abandoned me in a thunderstorm 40 miles from home because I asked where $15,000 went. As I stood there soaking wet and helpless, Derek drove away thinking he'd finally broken me. He had no idea I'd been recording everything for months. What happened next destroyed his entire criminal empire and saved dozens of other women from the same fate. This is the story of how one cruel lesson became the biggest mistake of his life. If you believe no one deserves to be abandoned in a storm, hit that like button now and let's dive into this incredible journey of justice. Don't forget to subscribe because stories like this need to reach every woman who thinks she's trapped with no way out. The rain hadn't started yet when Derek pulled into the parking lot of Meridian Steakhouse, but I could smell it coming through the Mercedes windows. 5 years of marriage, and I'd learned to read the signs of approaching storms, not just the weather kind. "You look beautiful tonight," Derek said, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. His reflection smiled back at him, not at me. That dress was expensive, but worth every penny. I smoothed the silk fabric over my knees. $1,500 for a dress I'd wear once. Charged to our joint account without discussion. Like everything else Derek decided we needed. Inside the restaurant, candlelight flickered across white tablecloths and the kind of wine list that required a second mortgage. Derek ordered for both of us. As always, filet mignon for him, salmon for me, because red meat makes women emotional. He'd explained years ago. "To us," he said, raising his glass of $100 wine. "To 5 perfect years." I lifted my water glass, watching the condensation drip onto the pristine tablecloth. Perfect years. If perfect meant walking on eggshells, measuring every word, apologizing for things I hadn't done. "Derek, I need to ask you about something." The words came out quieter than I'd intended. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let me guess. You've been going through our finances again." "It's our money, Marafamo. I have a right to know where $15,000 went." The restaurant noise faded around us. Other couples continued their conversations, their laughter, their normal anniversary dinners. But our table had become an island of tension. "Investment reallocation," Derek said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Portfolio diversification. Complex financial strategies you wouldn't understand. Try me. I have an MBA from Northwestern. From a second-tier program. And that was before I rescued you from that dead-end job at Henderson Financial. I'd been managing $30 million in assets at Henderson. But Derek had rewritten that history so many times. Even I sometimes forgot the truth. The money disappeared 3 days ago. From our joint savings. That's not an investment. Derek, that's theft." His fork clinked against the plate. Around us, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service and conversation, oblivious to the storm brewing at table 12. "You're embarrassing yourself, Sarah, and me." His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper I knew too well. "We'll discuss this at home." But I'd reached my limit. 5 years of discussions that went nowhere. Explanations that explained nothing. Apologies I didn't owe. "No, we'll discuss it now. Where did the money go?" Derek's smile could have cut glass. He signaled for the check, paid in cash from a roll of bills thick enough to choke on, and stood up. "Get in the car, Sarah, now." The first raindrops splattered against the windshield as we drove in silence through the darkening suburbs. But Derek wasn't heading home. We passed our neighborhood, kept driving past the familiar landmarks of our life together, onto highways I didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere quiet, where we can have a proper conversation about respect." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like angry fingers. Derek's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the dashboard light. I'd seen that grip before. Usually right before he explained why something was my fault. When he finally pulled over at a rest stop that looked abandoned in the middle of nowhere, my stomach dropped. The building was dark, boarded up, surrounded by weeds and broken concrete. No other cars, no lights except Derek's headlights cutting through the rain. "Get out," he said, not turning off the engine. "Derek, what are you doing?" "Teaching you a lesson about asking questions you don't want the answers to." I looked around at the desolation outside. The GPS showed 40 miles to home. No bus stops, no taxi service, no cell towers, according to the 0 bars on my phone. "You can't be serious." Actions have consequences, Sarah. Maybe a long walk in the rain will help you remember your place in this marriage. Lightning illuminated his face, and I saw something there I'd been ignoring for 5 years. Not anger, not frustration, cold calculation. This wasn't a moment of rage. This was planned. Derek, please. It's storming. I could get hurt out there. Then you'd better start walking. I sat frozen for a moment, rain hammering the car roof like bullets. This was my husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, the man who was now abandoning me in the middle of a thunderstorm because I'd asked where our money went. I opened the car door. The rain hit me like a physical blow, soaking through my expensive dress in seconds. Derek's headlights blinded me as I stepped onto the cracked asphalt, my heels clicking uselessly against the wet pavement. "I'll be waiting at home," he called through the passenger window. "When you get there, if you get there, maybe you'll have learned some respect." The Mercedes pulled away, taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving me alone in the storm with nothing but the sound of rain and my own rapid heartbeat. I stood there for 60 seconds, letting the reality sink in. My husband had abandoned me, 40 miles from home, in the worst storm of the season, because I'd asked about missing money. But as the shock wore off, something else took its place. Not the crushing despair Derek expected. Not the broken compliance he was counting on. Clarity. For the first time in 5 years, I could see Derek Mitchell clearly. Not the successful investment advisor. Not the charming husband who brought flowers after fights. The predator who'd been systematically isolating me from friends, controlling our finances, rewriting my memories until I couldn't trust my own thoughts. I pulled out my phone, surprised to find one bar of signal. My hands shook as I dialed. Not from cold, but from a mixture of rage and relief. "Jake, it's Sarah. I need help." My brother's voice crackled through the static. "Jesus, Sarah, where are you? It sounds like you're in the middle of a hurricane." "Close. Derek left me at some abandoned rest stop. I'm sending you my location. I'm coming to get you right now." "Jake, wait. There's something else. I think Derek's been stealing money. From our accounts, maybe from his clients. I need to know what to do." The line went quiet except for rain static. Then Jake's voice, deadly serious. "Don't go home tonight. Don't go anywhere Derek expects you to be. I'm calling Rachel Stone." Rachel Stone, the divorce attorney who'd represented Jake's ex-wife, known for taking down wealthy men who thought they were untouchable. "It might be nothing," I said, water dripping from my hair. "Maybe I'm overreacting." "Sarah, normal husbands don't abandon their wives in storms. Ever. This isn't about money. This is about control." A truck appeared through the rain, headlights cutting through the darkness. My heart jumped, thinking Derek had returned. But it was Jake's pickup. He'd made the 40-mile drive in 30 minutes. "Get in before you catch pneumonia," he said, wrapping me in a blanket that smelled like motor oil and safety. As we drove toward town, I told Jake everything. The missing money, Derek's explanations that never quite added up, the way he'd started controlling our social calendar, our finances, even my medication after I'd mentioned feeling anxious. "He's been giving you pills." Jake's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. "For anxiety, he said the doctor recommended them. But I never saw the doctor. Derek just brought them home one day." "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. We're going to a hotel tonight. Tomorrow, you're talking to Rachel and we're getting those pills tested." The hotel room felt like a sanctuary after the storm. Jake sat in the chair by the window while I changed into dry clothes he'd bought from the gift shop. When I emerged from the bathroom, he had his laptop open. "I've been thinking about this wrong," he said. "Derek didn't just abandon you tonight. He's been planning something. Men like him don't just snap. They calculate." He showed me the screen. A website about financial abuse, domestic control tactics, the warning signs of economic manipulation. "Look at this checklist. Sarah controls access to bank accounts. Check. Monitors spending. Check. Uses financial information to threaten or intimidate. Check." I read the list, recognizing my marriage in every bullet point. How had I missed it, or had Derek been so methodical that I'd lost the ability to see clearly? My phone buzzed. Derek's ringtone. I let it go to voicemail, then played it on speaker. Sarah, this is ridiculous. The lesson's over. Call me back and I'll come get you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Or 10 minutes later, another call. This time his voice had an edge. I know you have your phone. Stop being childish. I'm going to bed. Find your own way home. Jake raised an eyebrow. He's not worried about you. He's annoyed that his punishment isn't working. At midnight, my phone rang again. Not Derek this time. An unknown number. Hello, Sarah. This is Claire Roberts. I work with Derek. He asked me to call you. Derek's assistant, young, pretty, the kind of woman who made me feel invisible when she brought coffee to Derek's office meetings. He's worried about you, Claire continued. He said you had a fight and you're not answering his calls. He wants you to know he's sorry. Derek never apologized, never admitted fault. That he'd sent his assistant to deliver a fake apology showed how off balance he was becoming. I hung up without speaking, but something in Claire's voice nagged at me. Not concern, not professionalism, intimacy. The way she'd said Derek's name, like she had the right to worry about him. Jake, I said slowly, I think Derek's having an affair. I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Derek's panic was escalating with each one, his messages shifting from fake concern to barely controlled rage. Where the hell are you, Boyesha? This isn't funny anymore. You're making a mistake, Zara. Call me back now. Jake knocked on the adjoining room door with coffee and a grim expression. I called Rachel Stone. She can see you this morning. But Sarah, we need to move fast. I did some research on Derek's firm last night. He handed me a printed article from the Financial News. The headline made my stomach drop. SEC investigating Meridian Investment Group for possible client fund irregularities. Derek's company under federal investigation. This article is from 6 months ago, Jake said. Derek's been under scrutiny, and you asking questions about missing money probably terrified him. He's not just controlling. Sarah, he might be a criminal. The hotel breakfast felt like cardboard in my mouth. Every bite reminded me of the expensive meals Derek ordered, always insisting on the best, never explaining how we could afford it. I need to go home and get some things. I said, no, absolutely not. If Derek's desperate enough to abandon you in a storm, who knows what he'll do when cornered? My phone buzzed again. This time it was my sister Emma, Derek's favorite target for his charm offensive at family gatherings. Sarah, Derek called me. He's worried sick. He said you're having some kind of breakdown. I'm not having a breakdown. Emma, Derek left me at a rest stop 40 miles from home in the middle of a thunderstorm. Silence. Then quietly. That doesn't sound like Derek. When did you last talk to him besides this morning? Another pause. Longer this time. We've talked a few times. He's concerned about you. Sarah, he thinks you might need help. My blood went cold. Derek had been talking to my sister behind my back, laying groundwork, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state. How long had this been going on, Emma? Whatever Derek told you about me, it's not true. He said you'd say that. He said you've been paranoid lately, imagining things that aren't there. I hung up, hands shaking. Derek hadn't just isolated me from friends. He'd been poisoning my family against me, making them complicit in questioning my sanity. Rachel Stone's office occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, all glass and steel, and the kind of power that comes from destroying powerful men. Rachel herself was smaller than I'd expected, barely 5 feet tall, but her handshake could crack bones. Jake filled me in on the basics, she said, settling behind a desk covered with case files. Abandonment, financial control, possible affair. What else? I told her about the pills Derek had been giving me, the missing money, Claire's phone call, Emma's strange loyalty to Derek. How long has Derek been giving you medication? About 6 months, right after I started asking questions about our finances. Rachel's expression darkened. We're getting blood work done today. If Derek's been drugging you to keep you compliant, that's a felony. She pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes in precise handwriting. I need you to think carefully. Sarah, has Derek ever mentioned offshore accounts, travel plans, properties you don't know about? He talks about retirement a lot. Costa Rica. He says it's for the tax advantages. Men don't usually plan retirement to Central America for tax purposes. They plan it for countries without extradition treaties. The room seemed to tilt. Derek wasn't just having an affair or stealing from our accounts. He was planning to disappear, leaving me holding the bag for whatever crimes he'd committed. There's something else, I said. Last week, Derek had me sign some papers. He said they were for insurance purposes. Rachel's pen stopped moving. What kind of papers? I don't know. He said it was routine, that I didn't need to read them. I trusted him. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. I think your husband has been setting you up to take the fall for whatever he's been stealing. The abandonment last night wasn't punishment. It was him testing whether you'd fight back or just disappear quietly. My phone rang. Derek again. This time, though, Rachel gestured for me to answer and put it on speaker. Sarah, thank God. Where are you? I've been worried sick. His voice was different now. Not angry or controlling. Concerned. Loving, even. The Derek I'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. I'm safe, I said. Listen, about last night, I was stressed about work, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. Come home and we'll talk this through properly. Rachel raised an eyebrow at his sudden transformation. What about the money, Derek? The $15,000. We'll go through the accounts together tonight. I'll explain everything. I should have been more transparent. You have every right to know. After I hung up, Rachel leaned back in her chair. Classic abuser pattern. Punishment, then love bombing to draw the victim back in. He's probably destroyed evidence all night and now needs you home to sign more papers or provide alibis. So what do? You don't go home, you don't talk to Derek, and we start building a case that will put him in federal prison where he belongs. The blood work came back positive for lorazepam, a powerful anti-anxiety medication I'd never been prescribed. Derek had been drugging me for 6 months, keeping me docile while he dismantled our life. Rachel's investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, spread photos across the conference table. Surveillance shots of Derek entering a downtown apartment building. Derek at expensive restaurants with Claire Roberts. Derek at a bank I'd never heard of. Your husband's been living a double life, Marcus said. The apartment is registered to a shell company that traces back to Derek. He's been keeping Claire Roberts there for 8 months. The photos showed Derek and Claire together, intimate and comfortable. But what hurt wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that while Derek was playing loving husband at home, he was building a real relationship somewhere else. There's more, Marcus continued. Derek's been moving money systematically. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. The $15,000 you noticed is nothing compared to what we found. He showed me bank statements from accounts I'd never seen. Transfers to offshore banks, cryptocurrency purchases, property investments in countries with no extradition treaties. How much? I asked. So far, $2.7 million from client accounts. The number hit me like a physical blow. Derek wasn't just stealing from us. He was destroying the retirement savings of dozens of people who trusted him with their life savings. The SEC investigation is further along than the newspapers reported, Rachel said. They've been building a case for 2 years. Derek knows they're closing in, which explains why he's accelerating his timeline. Marcus added, the abandonment, the love bombing, the sudden willingness to be transparent. He needs you compliant while he executes his exit strategy. My phone buzzed with another text from Derek. Dinner at Meridian tonight, my treat. We need to celebrate our fresh start. The same restaurant where this had all started. Derek wanted me back in the place where he had control, where he could manipulate me into signing whatever documents would complete his escape plan. I have to go, I said. Rachel and Marcus both started objecting, but I held up my hand. Not to reconcile, to get evidence. If Derek's planning to run, he'll need my signature on financial documents tonight. We can record everything. It's too dangerous, Rachel said. If Derek realizes you know, he won't. I've been playing the submissive wife for 5 years. I can play it for one more night. Marcus fitted me with a recording device so small it looked like a shirt button. The wire ran along my bra line, invisible under the dress Derek liked best, the one that made me look vulnerable and grateful. If things go wrong, if you feel unsafe, Just say the word storm, Marcus said. We'll have people in the restaurant. What if he doesn't bring the papers? What if he just wants to talk? Then we've lost nothing. But Sarah, men like Derek don't invite reconciliation dinners unless they need something. He'll bring papers. Driving to Meridian felt like heading to my own execution. But for the first time in years, I wasn't the victim in this story. I was the investigator, gathering evidence to destroy the man who tried to destroy me. Derek was already waiting at our usual table, flowers and champagne and that smile that had once made me weak in the knees. Now it looked like what it had always been, the smile of a predator who thought he'd already won. You look beautiful, he said, kissing my cheek. I'm so glad you came. I was scared last night, I said, settling into my role. When you drove away, I thought you might not come back. I'll always come back for you, Sarah. You're my wife, my partner, my everything. The lies flowed like wine, smooth and poisonous. Derek ordered my meal, chose my drink, dominated the conversation while I nodded and smiled and let him think he was rebuilding my trust. I've been thinking about what you said, he continued, about the money, about transparency. You're right. We should make financial decisions together. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Legal documents, just as Marcus had predicted. These are just some updates to our accounts, Derek said. Beneficiary changes, power of attorney updates, routine stuff, but it'll give you more access to everything. I pretended to read while the recorder captured every word. The documents were anything but routine. They transferred ownership of our house to a trust controlled entirely by Derek, moved our remaining assets into accounts I couldn't access, and gave Derek power of attorney over my mother's estate. Why do you need control over my mother's money? I asked. Protection, Derek said smoothly. If something happens to you, I can make sure she's taken care of. It's what loving husbands do. The waiter brought our entrees, and Derek raised his glass in a toast. To new beginnings, he said, to trust and transparency, and the future we're building together. I lifted my glass, letting him think he'd won. To getting exactly what we deserve soon. I said. Derek walked me to my car like the perfect gentleman, holding my hand while I carried the signed documents that he believed would seal his escape route. He had no idea he'd just confessed to fraud and conspiracy on a federal recording. Drive carefully, he said, kissing me goodnight. I love you, Sarah. I love you too, I replied, the lie bitter on my tongue. But Derek didn't go home. Instead of following his usual route, he turned toward downtown, toward the apartment building where Claire Roberts was waiting. Marcus followed at a distance while I drove to Rachel's office, my hands shaking with adrenaline and relief. You did it, Rachel said, reviewing the recording. Clear confession to moving marital assets, admissions of offshore accounts, and conspiracy to defraud your mother's estate. The federal prosecutors are going to love this. But the victory felt hollow. While I've been gathering evidence, Derek was with Claire, probably celebrating his successful manipulation of his naive wife, the woman he'd been drugging for months while planning to frame her for his crimes. There's something else, Marcus said, returning from his surveillance. Derek didn't go to Claire's apartment. He went to a storage facility across town, stayed for an hour, came out with 2 suitcases. He's getting ready to run, Rachel said. We need to move fast. The next morning brought chaos. I woke to 17 missed calls from Emma, my mother, Derek's business partner, even Claire Roberts. Something had happened overnight, something that had thrown Derek's carefully planned timeline into chaos. Rachel called at 7 a.m. with news that made my blood run cold. The SEC raided Derek's office at 5 this morning. They also raided your house. Sarah, Derek's been arrested. Arrested for what? Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The federal prosecutors moved up their timeline after hearing our recording. But Sarah, there's a problem. She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Derek's claiming you were a co-conspirator. He says you knew about the offshore accounts, that you helped move the money, that the recording proves you were part of the conspiracy. The room spun around me. Even from a federal holding cell, Derek was still trying to manipulate the narrative, still trying to make me the villain in his story. That's impossible. The recording clearly shows The recording shows you signing documents and agreeing to financial arrangements. Derek's lawyer is claiming you were playing dumb to establish plausible deniability. I sank into the hotel room chair, feeling the walls closing in. Derek's final move wasn't abandoning me in the rain. It was making me his scapegoat, painting me as the criminal mastermind who'd manipulated the innocent husband. What do I do? We fight. We have the blood work proving he drugged you. We have evidence of financial abuse going back years. We have documentation of his affair and his plans to flee the country. Derek's lawyer is good, but the truth is better. But the truth felt fragile against Derek's version of events. He'd spent 5 years conditioning people to see me as fragile, confused, possibly unstable. Now he was using that conditioning as a weapon. My phone rang. Claire Roberts. Sarah, I need to talk to you. It's important. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, Derek's been lying to both of us. I have information that can help you. Against Rachel's advice, I agreed to meet Claire at a coffee shop downtown. She looked nothing like the polished assistant I'd met at Derek's office events. Her hair was unwashed, her makeup smeared, her hands shaking as she gripped her coffee cup. He told me you were crazy, she began without preamble, that you were paranoid and jealous in making his life hell. He said the marriage was over, that he was just waiting for the right time to leave. How long have you been sleeping with my husband? 8 months. But Sarah, it wasn't an affair, not the way he told it. Derek said you'd agreed to an open marriage, that you knew about me and approved. He said you were relieved he'd found someone else because it had took the pressure off you. Another lie, carefully constructed to make Claire complicit while keeping her conscience clear. He told me a lot of things that weren't true, Claire continued. But last night, after the arrests, I found something in his apartment. She pulled out a manila folder stuffed with documents, bank statements, property deeds, travel itineraries, all in Derek's handwriting. He was planning to disappear to Costa Rica next month, with $3 million and a woman named Isabella Martinez. I was never part of his escape plan. Sarah, I was just another victim. I stared at the documents, seeing Derek's web of deception laid out in black and white. Not just the money he'd stolen, not just the lies he'd told me, but an entirely fabricated life built on the destruction of everyone who'd trusted him. There's something else, Claire said. Derek's been recording our conversations for months. He has hours of audio of me talking about the offshore accounts, about moving money, about how much I love him and want to help him. He was setting you up too, just like he set you up. If the investigation had gone differently, Derek would have blamed both of us. The crazy wife and the greedy mistress who manipulated the innocent businessman. Claire pushed the folder across the table. I'm testifying against him. Sarah, whatever it takes to make sure he pays for what he's done to all of us. As I walked out of the coffee shop, clutching evidence of Derek's ultimate betrayal, I realized something important. For 5 years, Derek had made me feel like I was losing my mind, like I couldn't trust my own perceptions or memories. But I'd been right all along. The missing money, the suspicious behavior, the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with our marriage. My instincts had been accurate. Derek had just been very good at making me doubt them. The federal courthouse buzzed with reporters and cameras as Derek's arraignment began. I sat in the gallery with Rachel, watching the man I'd been married to for 5 years shuffle in wearing orange jumpsuit and shackles. He looked smaller than I remembered. Prison had stripped away his expensive suits and confident posture, revealing the hollow man underneath. When his eyes found mine across the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear, the prosecutor, Assistant Drew S., Attorney Jennifer Walsh, laid out the charges with methodical precision. 18 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, elder abuse for targeting retirement accounts, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. The defendant systematically defrauded clients over a 3-year period, stealing over $4 million while using his wife as an unwitting cover for his criminal enterprise. She told the judge, Derek's lawyer, an expensive criminal attorney named Richard Blackwood, tried to paint Derek as a victim of circumstances and poor judgment rather than a calculating predator. My client made mistakes, Your Honor, but these were business decisions gone wrong, not criminal intent. Mr. Mitchell was under tremendous pressure from his wife's mental health issues and his business partner's demands for higher returns. I watched Derek nod along, playing the role of the beleaguered husband whose unstable wife had driven him to desperate measures. Even facing federal prison, he was still trying to make me the villain in his story. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the bank statements, Claire's testimony, the proof of systematic drugging and financial abuse. Derek's carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of documentation. The judge denied bail. Mr. Mitchell has demonstrated a clear pattern of deception, has access to substantial hidden assets, and has shown himself to be a flight risk. He will remain in federal custody pending trial. As the bailiffs led Derek away, he turned back one more time. This time, instead of fear, I saw rage, pure, undiluted hatred for the wife who dared to fight back instead of disappearing quietly. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones toward me, shouting questions I didn't answer. Rachel guided me through the crowd while I kept my eyes forward, refusing to give Derek's story any more of my emotional energy. The investigation had expanded beyond Derek's firm. Federal agents had uncovered a network of financial advisors who'd been targeting elderly clients across multiple states, using similar tactics of isolation, drugging, and systematic theft. Derek wasn't working alone, Agent Patricia Coleman explained during our debriefing. He was part of an organized conspiracy that's defrauded victims of over $20 million. Your case broke it open. $20 million, retirement savings, college funds, nest eggs that dozens of families had spent decades building, all stolen by men like Derek who viewed other people's trust as a weakness to exploit. There's something else you need to know, Agent Coleman continued. We found evidence that Derek was planning to have you committed to a psychiatric facility after he disappeared. Long-term care, with him maintaining power of attorney over your assets. The room went cold. Derek hadn't just planned to steal from me and abandon me. He'd planned to have me locked away, drugged and helpless, while he lived freely on stolen money. He researched facilities, spoke with doctors, even forged some preliminary medical records documenting your alleged mental decline. If you hadn't fought back when you did, Sarah, you might have spent years in an institution while Derek convinced everyone you were too unstable to manage your own life. I thought about Emma, about how easily Derek had convinced my own sister that I was having a breakdown, how he'd laid groundwork with friends and family, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state for months before implementing his final plan. The systematic nature of it was breathtaking. Derek hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my reality, my relationships, my sense of self. The abandonment in the rain had been a test run for the ultimate abandonment he'd been planning. But as I sat in that federal building, surrounded by agents and lawyers who believed my story and took my pain seriously, I realized something profound. Derek's greatest miscalculation hadn't been financial. It had been assuming that 5 years of abuse had broken me completely. Instead, those 5 years had taught me to survive, to recognize the warning signs, to document everything, to plan for the worst while hoping for the better. When people ask me now about that night at the rest stop, about standing in the rain while my husband drove away, they expect me to describe devastation, trauma, the moment my world ended. But that's not what happened. Standing in that storm, soaked and abandoned and 40 miles from home, I finally saw clearly for the first time in years. My world hadn't ended. Derek's had. 6 months later, I sat in the witness box of federal district court, raising my right hand to swear an oath to tell the truth. Derek sat at the defendant's table 30 feet away, but he might as well have been on another planet. The woman who'd stood in the rain that night felt like a different person. I'd cut my hair, changed my style, rebuilt my life from the ground up. Most importantly, I'd remembered who I was before Derek Mitchell had tried to erase me. Prosecutor Walsh approached the witness stand with a gentle smile and a folder full of evidence that would bury Derek forever. "Mrs. Bennett," she began, using my maiden name that I'd reclaimed, "can you tell the court about the night of June 15th, when your then husband abandoned you at the rest stop?" I told the story clearly, without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. The missing money, the restaurant confrontation, the 40-mile drive to nowhere, Derek's calculated cruelty as he drove away. "And how did you feel when you realized you were stranded, afraid him, but also for the first time in years, completely clear about who my husband really was. Derek's lawyer objected to several questions, but Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense jurist known for her expertise in financial crimes, overruled most of them. She'd seen enough predators like Derek to recognize the patterns. Mrs. Bush Bennett, were you aware that your husband had been administering medication to you without your knowledge? Not at the time. I thought the pills were prescribed by my doctor. Derek told me I was anxious, that I needed help managing stress. I trusted him. And what did blood tests reveal about these medications? That I'd been drugged with lorazepam for 6 months. Strong anti-anxiety medication that would have made me docile, confused, easier to manipulate. The jury was taking notes, their faces showing the appropriate horror at Derek's systematic abuse. But the real damage came when Prosecutor Walsh played the restaurant recording. Derek's voice filled the courtroom, smooth and confident, as he explained the financial documents he needed me to sign. The jury heard him lying about routine paperwork while actually stealing my inheritance and setting me up to take blame for his crimes. Did you understand what you were signing that night? I thought I was signing insurance updates. The recording shows Derek deliberately misrepresenting documents that would have given him complete control over my assets and my mother's estate. Derek's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. His lawyer painted me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge, a woman who'd participated in moving money and then cried victim when caught. Isn't it true, Mrs. Bennett, that you knew about the offshore accounts? I knew Derek had mentioned retirement accounts. I didn't know he was stealing from clients to fund them. But you signed documents transferring marital assets under duress, while being drugged, and based on Derek's lies about what the documents contained. You recorded your husband without his knowledge. Doesn't that suggest premeditation on your part? It suggests I was trying to protect myself from a man who'd been systematically destroying my life. The lawyer tried for 3 hours to make me look like a co-conspirator or a gold-digging ex-wife, but the evidence was too strong, and Derek had left too clear a trail of manipulation and abuse. Claire Roberts testified next, describing how Derek had used her feelings for him to manipulate her into moving money and providing alibis. She'd brought recordings of her own, conversations where Derek bragged about controlling me and planning his escape. He called Sarah his insurance policy. Claire said, tears streaming down her face. He said she was so broken that she'd take the blame for anything rather than lose him completely. The most damaging testimony came from Derek's own business partner, Tom Harris, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. Derek specifically targeted elderly clients with early-stage dementia or recent spousal deaths. Tom explained. He'd gain their trust, convince them to sign power of attorney documents, then systematically drain their accounts. How many clients were affected? At least 47 that we've identified. Total losses exceed $6 million. The courtroom was silent as Tom described Derek's methods. The fake medical consultations to convince elderly clients they were becoming incompetent. The forged documents, the elaborate shell companies designed to hide stolen money. Derek told me his wife was getting suspicious, asking questions about their finances. He said he needed to handle the Sarah problem before she complicated things. What did you understand that to mean? Based on our conversations, I believe Derek was planning to have Sarah committed to a psychiatric facility. He'd researched long-term care options and spoken with doctors about documenting her alleged mental decline. My blood ran cold hearing it described so clinically. Derek hadn't just planned to abandon me. He'd planned to erase me completely, stealing not just my money but my freedom and dignity. The prosecution rested after 5 days of testimony. Derek's defense lasted 6 hours. His lawyer called character witnesses who described Derek as a devoted husband and successful businessman, but none of them could explain the mountain of evidence documenting his crimes. Derek himself never took the stand. His lawyer was smart enough to know that putting a narcissistic predator in front of a jury would only make things worse. Closing arguments were a formality. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern of abuse undeniable, the financial crimes documented in excruciating detail. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty on all counts. As the verdicts were read, Derek's composure finally cracked. The man who'd spent years controlling every aspect of my life broke down completely when faced with his own powerlessness. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she had some words for Derek before the bailiffs led him away. Mr. Mitchell, You targeted the most vulnerable members of society. You betrayed the trust of clients, colleagues, friends, and family. You showed no remorse and accepted no responsibility even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of your crimes. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. You will also pay full restitution to your victims, though I doubt that money can repair the damage you've caused to their lives and sense of security. 25 years. Derek would be 70 when he got out, assuming he lived that long in federal prison. As I walked out of the courthouse, reporters asked how I felt about the verdict. I thought about that night in the rain, about standing alone at that abandoned rest stop while Derek drove away, thinking he'd broken me forever. I feel free, I said simply. 1 year after Derek's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the Sarah's Foundation, looking at a wall covered with thank you cards and success stories. 43 women had found safety and justice through our programs, each one a reminder that Derek's attempt to destroy me had instead created something powerful and lasting. The foundation occupied a renovated Victorian mansion in downtown Minneapolis. Its 3 stories housing legal aid offices, counseling rooms, a forensic accounting department, and an emergency shelter for women escaping financial abuse. The Morrison case just settled, announced Rachel Stone, who'd taken a leave from her private practice to serve as our legal director. $300,000 in damages, plus Derek's former partner agrees to testify in the next phase of prosecutions. The federal investigation had expanded into a nationwide network of financial predators, with Derek's case serving as the template for understanding their methods. 17 more advisors had been arrested, and the total recovery for victims was approaching $30 million. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Coleman. New arrest in Phoenix. Same pattern, same network. Your case broke this whole thing open. Oh, it felt surreal sometimes, knowing that the worst night of my life had become the foundation for protecting other women. Derek had tried to teach me about powerlessness. Instead, he'd shown me exactly how power should be used. Jake knocked on my office door, carrying a box of files from the latest intake interviews. We've got 3 new cases this week, he said. Investment advisor in Denver, insurance agent in Atlanta, and a CPA in Portland, all using Derek's playbook. My brother had become the foundation's chief investigator, his natural protective instincts and mechanical precision perfect for uncovering hidden assets and documenting abuse. Watching him work with survivors, I often thought about how Derek had tried to isolate me from family support. Jake's presence in my life now felt like a special kind of justice. How are they holding up? I asked. Scared but determined. They all mentioned seeing your interview on CNN, said it gave them hope. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Every major network wanted to talk about the wife who'd taken down her abusive husband and exposed a criminal conspiracy. But I'd learned to use the platform carefully, focusing on education rather than sensationalism. Claire Roberts appeared in my doorway, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of professional outfit that would have looked foreign on Derek's manipulated assistant. The Colorado AG's office wants you to testify next month, she said. 3 more advisors using the isolation and drugging tactics. Claire had become our outreach coordinator, using her experience with Derek to help other women recognize the signs of professional manipulation. Her transformation from victim to advocate had been remarkable to witness. Also, she continued with a slight smile, there's a reporter from the Financial Times here. She wants to discuss the anniversary article, 1 year since Derek's arrest. The media loved milestone stories, and this case had become a symbol of how financial abuse could be fought and defeated. But for me, the real milestone wasn't measured in months or news cycles. It was measured in the 43 women who'd escaped situations similar to mine, in the millions of dollars recovered for elderly victims, in the network of support that now existed where none had before. The reporter, Janet Miller, was younger than I'd expected, but clearly knowledgeable about financial crimes. What's next for the foundation, she asked, setting up her recording equipment in my office. Expansion. We're opening satellite offices in Chicago and Denver, partnering with existing domestic violence organizations to add financial expertise to their services. The goal is to make sure no woman has to face what Derek put me through without resources and support. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't fought back? I thought about Derek's plan to have me committed, about the psychiatric facility, in the forged medical records, in the life he'd intended to steal from me. I know what would have happened. Derek would have destroyed me completely, stolen everything I had, and moved on to his next victim. The 47 elderly clients he defrauded would never have gotten justice. The network of predators would still be operating. Any regrets about how things played out? Only that it took me 5 years to see clearly. But Derek was very good at what he did. The manipulation, the gaslighting, the systematic erosion of my confidence and judgment. I'm not embarrassed that it worked for a while. I'm proud that I eventually broke free. After the interview, I walked through the foundation's offices, checking on the various programs we'd built. The financial forensics lab where Grace Williams and her team tracked hidden assets. The legal aid clinic where Rachel and 3 other attorneys provided free representation. The counseling center where trained therapists help survivors rebuild their sense of reality after years of manipulation. Every room told a story of resilience, of women who'd refused to stay broken, who'd turned their pain into power and their survival into service. My phone rang as I reached my car. Unknown number. Probably another reporter or potential client. "Sarah, this is Emma, my sister." We'd spoken twice since Derek's trial. Awkward conversations where she tried to apologize for believing his lies about my mental state. "I saw the news story about the anniversary," she said. "About everything you've built." "Emma, let me finish. I was wrong. About Derek, about you, about everything. He manipulated me just like he manipulated everyone else, and I should have seen it." I sat in my car, listening to my sister's voice crack with emotion. "I've been in therapy, trying to understand how I let him turn me against you. The therapist says it's called triangulation, using one relationship to control another. You were trying to help, Emma. Derek was very convincing. I should have trusted you instead of him. You're my sister. My loyalty should have been automatic." "It's okay, really. Derek fooled everyone, including me, for years. Can we have lunch sometime? I want to hear about the foundation, about what you're building. I want to understand how you turned something so terrible into something so important." As I drove home to the apartment I'd furnished myself with money I'd earned myself, I thought about forgiveness and healing and the long process of rebuilding relationships that abuse had damaged. Derek was 2 years into a 25-year sentence, probably still believing he was the victim of vindictive women who'd conspired to destroy an innocent man. His delusion was complete and apparently permanent, but the rest of us had chosen reality over comfortable lies. We'd chosen the hard work of healing over the easy comfort of denial. We'd chosen to use our pain as fuel for protecting others rather than letting it consume us. The rain started as I reached my building, fat drops hitting the windshield like that night 3 years ago when Derek had abandoned me at the rest stop. But this time, the storm felt different. Not threatening or dangerous, but cleansing. Washing away the last remnants of the woman who'd been too afraid to ask questions, too conditioned to fight back, too isolated to believe in her own worth. That woman had died in the rain that night. The woman who'd survived was stronger, wiser, and absolutely committed to making sure Derek's cruelty would never succeed again. 3 years after that night in the rain, I received a letter that made me smile. The return address was Federal Correctional Institution Sandstone, and Derek's handwriting was still perfectly controlled despite his circumstances. "Sarah," it began, "I hope you've learned your lesson." 4 pages of rage and blame followed, painting me as the vindictive architect of his downfall rather than the victim of his systematic abuse. Derek listed every perceived slight, every moment he now realized had been part of my plan to destroy his life. He accused me of orchestrating everything from the beginning, of recording conversations and gathering evidence while pretending to be the dutiful wife. He claimed I'd manipulated federal investigators, corrupted witnesses, and turned his friends and family against him. The final paragraph was pure Derek. "I gave you everything, a beautiful home, financial security, a lifestyle you never could have achieved on your own. This is how you repay generosity. I hope the guilt destroys you the way you destroyed me." I had the letter framed and hung it in my office, right next to my law's degree and the Foundation's first major award for victim advocacy. When clients asked about it, I told them the truth. Derek Mitchell still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. 3 years in federal prison hadn't taught him empathy or remorse or basic human decency. He remained convinced that he was the victim, that the women he'd abused and defrauded had somehow victimized him. But his letter proved something important that Derek would never change, never grow, never become the man he pretended to be during our marriage. The charming, successful husband had been a performance, and prison had stripped away his ability to maintain the facade. The real Derek was exactly what I'd suspected during those long nights when I'd wondered if I was losing my mind. A hollow, angry man who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded. "Another love letter from your ex?" Rachel asked, reviewing Derek's latest legal filing. He'd exhausted his appeals and was now filing frivolous lawsuits from prison, claiming his civil rights had been violated by the investigation. "He wants me to know I haven't won," I said, "that he's still fighting." Men like Derek never accept responsibility. In his mind, he's always the victim of circumstances beyond his control. The irony was perfect. Derek had tried to teach me about power and control, about knowing my place and accepting my circumstances. Now he was the one trapped in a cage, powerless and controlled, while I'd built a life and career he could never have imagined. The foundation had expanded to 12 cities, with satellite offices providing services to financial abuse survivors across the country. We'd recovered over $50 million in stolen assets and helped prosecute 37 predators using Derek's methods. But the real victory wasn't measured in dollars or prison sentences. It was measured in transformation, in women who'd discovered their strength, reclaimed their voices, rebuilt their lives from nothing, like Maria Stewart, who'd escaped her husband's control with 3 children and was now finishing her master's degree in social work, like Helen Cooper, whose husband had stolen her inheritance and convinced her she was developing dementia, now running a support group for elderly abuse survivors, like Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor who'd handled Derek's case and had since specialized in financial abuse crimes, using our foundation as a resource for understanding victim psychology. Each success story felt personal, a middle finger to Derek's belief that women were weak, that victims stayed victims. That abuse was just the natural order of things. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Emma's number. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I'm getting married." My sister had been dating a teacher named Michael for 2 years, someone kind and patient who'd helped her work through the guilt and manipulation Derek had inflicted on our family. "That's wonderful, Emma. When's the wedding?" "Next spring, and Sarah, I want you to be my maid of honor." The request caught me off guard. Emma and I had been rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully. Both of us scarred by how easily Derek had turned us against each other. "Are you sure I know things have been complicated between us? You're my sister. You fought for all of us, even when we couldn't see what was happening. I want you standing beside me when I promise to love someone who actually deserves it." After we hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the city Derek had once dominated through fear and manipulation. He'd owned expensive properties here, entertained clients at exclusive restaurants, networked with powerful people who'd respected his apparent success. Now his properties had been sold to pay restitution to his victims. His former colleagues crossed the street to avoid association with his name. His powerful friends had discovered urgent business elsewhere when he'd needed character references. Derek had built his life on other people's trust and pain. When that foundation crumbled, everything he'd thought was his crumbled with it. But the foundation I'd built was different. It was based on truth, on genuine service, on using strength to protect rather than exploit. Every woman we helped made it stronger. Every predator we exposed made it more necessary. Derek's legacy was destruction. Mine would be restoration. That evening, I drove past the rest stop where Derek had abandoned me. It had been renovated since then, turned into a proper travel center with lights and security cameras and 24-hour service. But I could still see the place it had been that night, dark, isolated. The perfect setting for Derek's cruel lesson about power and place. Standing in that spot now, dry and safe and in control of my own life, I thought about the woman who'd been left here 3 years ago, soaked and shivering and 40 miles from home. She'd had no idea what she was capable of becoming. Derek had intended the abandonment as the final breaking point, the moment when I'd finally accept my powerlessness and submit completely to his control. Instead, it had been my liberation. The moment when I'd stopped trying to save a marriage that had never existed and started fighting for a life worth living. The rain began again as I got back in my car, But this time it felt like a blessing rather than a punishment, a reminder that storms pass, that survival is possible, that sometimes you have to get completely soaked before you can see clearly enough to find your way home. Derek had taught me exactly one lesson, though not the one he'd intended. He'd taught me that cruelty creates its own destruction, that predators eventually devour themselves, and that the best revenge against someone who tries to break you is becoming unbreakable, then using that strength to make sure they can never break anyone else again. 5 years after Derek Mitchell left me in the rain to teach me a lesson, I stood on the courthouse steps in Denver, watching another financial predator being led away in handcuffs. The case had taken 8 months to build, but the pattern was familiar: systematic drugging of a spouse, theft of client funds, plans to disappear and leave the wife to face federal charges. This time, we'd caught him before he could execute his escape plan. "That's number 41, Agent Coleman said, joining me on the steps. 41 predators using Derek's methods. Makes you wonder how many more are out there." "Not wondering," I replied. "Planning. The Foundation's opening offices in Portland and Phoenix next year, and we're launching a training program for law enforcement." The network Derek had belonged to was larger than anyone had initially realized. Financial abuse wasn't isolated incidents of bad behavior. It was systematic, organized, with predators sharing tactics and techniques across state lines. But our network was growing faster than theirs. Survivors helping survivors, law enforcement agencies sharing intelligence, federal prosecutors coordinating prosecutions. The Foundation had become the center of a movement that Derek had accidentally created when he tried to destroy one stubborn woman who'd refused to stay broken. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Portland arrest made the national news. They mentioned the Foundation and showed your picture. Derek's going to hate that." Derek had been transferred to a medium security facility in Colorado after several violent incidents at his previous prison. Apparently, other inmates didn't appreciate men who targeted elderly victims and abandoned their wives in storms. Prison had its own version of justice. I'd stopped reading his letters after the 15th one, all variations on the same theme. I was vindictive, manipulative, ungrateful. I'd destroyed a good man out of spite and jealousy. I should be ashamed of myself. His sister Margaret still sent occasional emails blaming me for Derek's downfall, painting him as a victim of my vindictive conspiracy. Some people needed their delusions to survive, and I'd learned not to waste energy trying to shatter them. The truth was available for anyone who wanted to see it. 41 arrests, 57 million in recovered assets, testimony from over 200 victims, federal task forces in 12 states. Derek's crimes were documented in excruciating detail, but his family preferred the version where he'd been a successful businessman destroyed by a calculating wife who'd seduced federal agents into manufacturing evidence. Their denial was irrelevant. Justice didn't require their acceptance. My phone rang as I walked to my car. Emma's number. "Sarah, turn on Channel 7. They're doing a story about the Foundation." I found a news broadcast on my phone, watching as reporter Jennifer Walsh stood outside our Minneapolis headquarters. "The Sarah Foundation has revolutionized how law enforcement approaches financial abuse," she was saying. "Founded by Sarah Bennett, a survivor of systematic financial and emotional abuse, the Foundation has helped prosecute 41 predators and recover over $57 million for victims." The story cut to footage of me speaking at a congressional hearing about financial crimes, advocating for stronger penalties and better victim protections. Bennett's work has inspired similar foundations across the country, creating a network of support that didn't exist when she escaped her own abusive situation 5 years ago. They interviewed Maria Stewart, now a licensed social worker specializing in abuse survivors, Helen Cooper, whose support group had helped dozens of elderly victims, Jennifer Walsh, whose prosecutions had become models for federal attorneys nationwide. "Sarah Bennett saved my life," Maria said to the camera. "But more than that, she showed me how to use my survival to help others. That's the real power of what she's built." The story ended with footage of Derek being led away in handcuffs 5 years ago, followed by current shots of the Foundation's work legal clinics, support groups, training seminars, congressional testimony. "From victim to advocate to national leader," the reporter concluded, "Sarah Bennett has transformed personal tragedy into public service, proving that sometimes the best response to cruelty is kindness to others." I sat in my car, watching the story replay on my phone, thinking about the journey from that abandoned rest stop to this moment. The woman Derek had tried to break had become someone he'd never imagined possible. Not just a survivor, but a force for justice. Not just a victim who'd escaped, but a leader who'd made escape possible for hundreds of others. That evening, I spoke at the University of Minnesota Law School about financial abuse and victim advocacy. The auditorium was packed with students, attorneys, and survivors, all eager to understand how legal systems could better serve abuse victims. During the Q&A, a young woman asked the question I'd been expecting. How do you forgive someone who did what your ex-husband did to you? I thought about Derek's letters from prison, still blaming me for his circumstances. About Margaret's emails insisting her brother was innocent. About the 41 predators who'd used his methods to destroy other women's lives. I don't forgive Derek Mitchell, I said. Forgiveness requires remorse, growth, acknowledgement of harm caused. Derek has shown none of those things. He remains convinced he's the victim. But doesn't that make you bitter angry? No, it makes me determined. Derek taught me that there are people in the world who view others as objects to be used and discarded. People who will smile while they poison you, who will claim to love you while systematically destroying your life. I paused, looking out at the audience full of future advocates and survivors. But Derek also taught me that such people are ultimately weak. They can only succeed through deception and manipulation. When exposed to the light, they crumble. The foundation isn't about Derek Mitchell. It's about making sure the next woman trapped in a storm like mine has somewhere to turn for help. After the event, I drove home through the Minneapolis streets Derek had once owned through wealth and influence. His former office building now housed a nonprofit providing services to domestic violence survivors. His favorite restaurant had renamed itself after the owner learned about his crimes. Even his physical presence had been erased from the city he'd once dominated. But the change he'd created lived on, just not in the way he'd intended. Every woman the foundation helped, every predator we exposed, every law we helped pass was part of Derek's legacy. His attempt to teach me a lesson about powerlessness had created a movement that would outlive us both. At home in my apartment filled with photos from the foundation's work, I opened my laptop to review tomorrow's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. They were considering the Financial Abuse Prevention Act, legislation that would strengthen penalties for predators like Derek and provide better resources for survivors. The bill was named after Helen Cooper, the elderly woman Derek had convinced she was developing dementia while he stole her life savings. As I worked on my prepared remarks, rain began hitting my windows. Not the violent storm of that night 5 years ago, but gentle drops that seemed to wash the day clean. I thought about Derek in his prison cell, probably writing another letter about how unfair his life had become. Still convinced he was the victim, still blaming everyone but himself for the consequences of his choices. He tried to teach me about knowing my place, about accepting powerlessness, about the natural order of things. Instead, he taught me that the natural order was whatever we chose to build, that power meant using strength to protect rather than exploit, that the best lesson anyone could teach was showing others how to survive and thrive despite the cruelty of predators. Derek Mitchell had abandoned me in a storm, confident he'd broken me forever. He'd never been more wrong about anything in his life. The woman he'd left in that rain had become the storm that swept away everything he'd built on other people's pain. And that storm was still growing, still gathering strength, still protecting others from men who thought teaching cruel lessons was their right. Some lessons, it turned out, had consequences the teacher never saw coming, and those were always the most important ones.